This video is going to focus on the presidential election of 1912. This is a very interesting election for many reasons I'm going to highlight. First of all, in a typical presidential election, there are two major candidates. As you can see on the screen, this election featured four prominent candidates, including a current president, former president, and future president. This election was the first time in which political parties used primaries. A primary means that voters within a party have a say in determining who the party's nominee will be. So that way, it's not just the party bosses who determine the nominee, people are part of the process. In 1912, only a few states used primaries, but it was the start of the primary process nevertheless. Let me clean off the screen and we can take a look at the context of the time period. So this election was happening at a time known as the Progressive Era. Progressive Era. Progressive Era lasted from about 1890 through 1920, and it was a time in which people were trying to create economic, social, and political reforms. Changes such as creating an 8-hour workday and making workplaces safer, regulating big businesses. That's a picture of a factory. There was an effort to get the government to break up big business trusts and monopolies, so instead there would be smaller businesses. There was an effort to conserve environmental resources. Women were fighting for the right to vote. There was a movement to reform government to end corruption, which is why political party primaries were started. So the Progressive Era was a time of great change. That's the context of this election. Let me clean the screen and we can take a look at the candidates. The sitting president who was running for re-election was William Howard Taft, and Taft was a Republican, so I'll put an R for Republican. Usually, when a sitting president runs for a second term, members of that president's party step aside and allow the president to assume the party nomination unopposed. That didn't happen in this election. A prominent Republican challenged Taft, and that man is Teddy Roosevelt, or TR, so he was also a Republican. Roosevelt had been a Republican president from 1901 to 1909. In fact, at the end of Roosevelt's second term, he endorsed Taft for president. So the two men had been quite close. However, they had a falling out over a number of issues. I'll just give two quick examples. On the tariff issue, Taft had supported the Payne-Aldrich Act, which raised the tariff, and Roosevelt was in favor of lowering the tariff. On the issue of big business trusts, Taft had pursued an antitrust case against U.S. Steel, and Roosevelt disagreed with that. So for those two reasons specifically, but for a variety of others as well, Roosevelt and Taft had a rift, and that prompted Roosevelt to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination. Roosevelt was very popular in America and certainly within the Republican Party, so he was a formidable challenger. He did well in the states that held primaries. However, Taft was more popular among the party bosses, so ultimately Taft won the Republican nomination for president. Roosevelt then decided to leave the Republican Party, and in doing so, he decided to create his own political party called the Progressive Party. So I'll put a P for progressive. At the Progressive Party convention, a prominent reformer named Jane Addams seconded his nomination, and she became the first woman to give a speech at a major party convention. Roosevelt accepted the nomination and declared himself to be as fit as a bull moose. And so the Progressive Party took on the nickname the Bull Moose Party. All right, enough about Roosevelt and Taft. Let's take a look at the other two candidates on the left side of the screen. Woodrow Wilson won the nomination for the Democrats. Wilson and D for Democrats. Wilson had been an academic and he was a former president of Princeton University and he was the governor of New Jersey, so he won the nomination for the Democrats. All the way on the left was a prominent labor leader named Eugene Debs. Debs was running for the Socialist Party, and that was his fourth campaign for president. He would run 5 times overall. In 1912, it was his fourth run. So those are the 4 candidates. Let me clean the screen and we can take a look at the campaign itself. All right, Debs, while he was a popular figure in the labor movement and he was part of a growing socialist movement in America in the early 1900s, he didn't have a very good chance of actually winning the election. Taft had been pushed to the sidelines by Roosevelt, and he didn't campaign much, so the race really came down to Wilson and Roosevelt. Wilson and Roosevelt both saw themselves and branded themselves as progressives. They just had a different brand of progressivism. Roosevelt had pursued progressive policies as president, and as governor, Wilson had also pursued progressive policies. So the challenge was for each of these candidates to differentiate themselves. Let's take a look at how they did so. In terms of policy, Roosevelt nicknamed his platform of ideas New Nationalism. Let's see if I can get nationalism to fit on the screen. It does. It encroaches upon Taft a little bit, but that's okay. Actually, Roosevelt's candidacy encroached upon Taft, so that worked out rather well. Wilson's platform was known as New Freedom. New Freedom. All right, I'll describe the difference between these two platforms in terms of one issue, big business trusts. When it came to trusts, Roosevelt thought that the government should regulate good trusts and break up bad trusts. Wilson disagreed with that philosophy because he thought it gave the government a paternalistic role, and Wilson preferred a more limited role for government. So Wilson thought that instead the government should break up big trusts, and that would provide more opportunities, more freedom for small businessmen, and the competition that would exist among small businessmen would mean the government didn't need to regulate them, so government would be more limited. So that was a fundamental policy difference between Wilson and Roosevelt. In terms of style, the two men were also quite different. Roosevelt was known for his energy and his enthusiasm. During the campaign, he was even shot in the chest by an assassin. The bullet pierced through his coat, his speech, and an eyeglasses case before entering his chest. Before going to the hospital, though, Roosevelt gave a 90-minute speech. That just added to his legend as a man of strength and vigor. Wilson was not as charismatic, but he was still an effective speaker and a very persuasive one as well. So it made for a good race between Wilson and Roosevelt. Let me clean off the screen again, and we can take a look at the election results. It's important to mention that in the United States, the Electoral College system is used in presidential elections. So there's actually two votes that get counted. One vote is called the popular vote. The other is the electoral vote. I have a video on the Electoral College if you need more information, but the short version is that people vote for electors, and the electors then vote for the president. So let's look at the vote totals for the candidates. Taft received 23% of the popular vote, but only 1% of the electoral vote, which was the lowest for a sitting president. Teddy Roosevelt received 27% of the popular vote and 17% of the electoral vote. Woodrow Wilson got 42% of the popular vote and 82% of the electoral vote. Finally, Eugene Debs got 6% of the popular vote and no electoral votes. So, in the United States Electoral College system, the winner is the person who receives a majority of the electoral votes, which was obviously Woodrow Wilson with his 82%. So Wilson won the election. What this election shows is that a political party cannot divide itself and expect to win. What I mean by that is the Republicans were likely to win about 50% of the votes in the country. Taft was running as a Republican. Roosevelt, though, was running as a former Republican, and that split the party. Taft won support from the conservative Republicans. Roosevelt won support from the moderate and progressive Republicans. Either way, they split that 50% of likely Republican voters in America, and that paved the way for Wilson's victory. So it's not that Wilson was so popular. In fact, he only earned 42% of the popular vote. It was more so that Roosevelt and Taft had hurt each other's chances to win the election, and so Wilson was the winner. That's a short overview of the election of 1912. If you want more videos and content, check out my website at citizengenius.org.